Hello and welcome to the second Then and Now special where, wow, it only took nearly a year to get a second one of these out. Guess that makes it an annual special, huh? If you're new or haven't watched the previous Then and Now, which was on the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers comics, please do so. I'm mostly happy with how it turned out, even if no one watched it. Then and Now is a special where I, the great and powerful AJ the Comic Archivist, compares the first ever issue of a property and the most recent version of that property. Basically, think of it as old versus new, except a lot more wordy. Lois Lane is one of those characters that I really don't have to explain who she is, right? She was introduced right in Action Comics #1 as a strong, independent reporter for the Daily Planet. Sometimes love interest to Superman, other times professional rival of Clark Kent. While the character has changed since her debut in 1938, her personality would generally remain consistent, though many associate her more with a standard damsel in distress since comics, be they old or new, really do like putting love interests for their heroes in danger far more than they really should. And in her publication history, Lois would arguably become the most popular woman in comics through the 40s and 50s, even rivaling Betty and Veronica from Archie's comics, who were beyond popular, but that's a different show. Though she did have her own storylines in Action Comics, they would generally tie back in with Superman since it was his book and all. She didn't get her own official title until a tryout in Showcase #9, which was, to put it kindly, not a progressive look at the character or women in general, with the plot basically being her and Lana Lang getting into a dick measuring contest over who Superman likes better. Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to talk about that issue eventually, but again, that's a different show. However, it was a hit, so they officially greenlit her own solo series in 1958, Superman's Girlfriend, Lois Lane. Now, just remember when they named the book, it was after Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen had already come out, so the naming convention was already in place, and it wasn't just a jab to try and pull readers about Lois Lane being the love interest for Superman. In fact, that is why, in the title, it's Superman's Girl Space Friend, and not Superman's Girlfriend. I know, it's pedantic, but that's how it goes. The book lasted until 1974, when it was canceled the same year as Jimmy Olsen's book, to be combined into the Superman family book. Fun fact, when it was at the height of popularity in 1962, it was actually the third best-selling comic book, beaten only by the Superman and Superboy titles. And looking at the sales figure available, it sold fairly well throughout. Without going into specifics, which I may actually start a reader's history for Lois's solo history, just because the Catwoman one did so well. Yes, I've set up a few future projects already. Anyways, after that title finished, she did have some other solo titles, though they mainly just were one-shots and, I think, one miniseries. She had a 2-issue mini in 1986, a one-shot that tied into the Girl Frenzy line of one-shots in 1998, the 3-issue tie-in mini Lois Lane and the Resistance during the Flashpoint event in 2011, and then a one-shot in 2014. While not technically a solo series, towards the end of the New 52 DCU era, the post-crisis and most famous incarnation of Lois and her husband, post-crisis Superman, and their Superboy son John had their own series called Lois and Clark, as they adapted to life being brought into the New 52 series. And that Lois is who we follow in her latest ongoing, though she is also currently a major player in Event Leviathan. So Lois is hopefully coming back into her own in a big way. With that very abridged history out of the way, that brings us to the now with Lois Lane #1 from 2019. For the sake of my sanity, I'm calling the Lois Lane book Lois Lane, and Superman's Girlfriend is going to be Superman's Girlfriend. That shouldn't be too hard to follow, right? So how do we compare these two vastly different comics? Well, the first answer is fairly easy, with the story. Superman's Girlfriend, Lois Lane #1, has 3 stories in it. And, well, let's just start this. The first is The Bombshell of the Boulevards, where Lois impersonates Lois Laflamme, or Laflamme, a French actress, so she can get a scoop from an ambassador. Clark finds out about this and decides to be a righteous jackass to, and I'm quoting the comic here, teach her a lesson. Marty, sum it up for me.
He's an asshole.
Thank you. I think it's to teach her that there should be limits to what she does for a story, since she is trying to sweet-talk an ambassador and lying about who she is for a scoop. But yeah, he's kind of a dick. I'll be skipping over the one-page comics that have nothing to do with Lois, at least for this video. So next one is Lois Lane, Super Chef. So, to win Superman's heart, since she's trying every hat to get Superman to marry her, Lois takes a leave of absence from the Daily Planet to be a chef at a diner for Superman. However, slapstick keeps getting in the way, oddly because Superman accidentally keeps screwing her over with his X-ray vision. Yeah, I already used Marty, so Raylan?
You ever hear the saying, you run into an asshole in the morning, you ran into an asshole? You run into assholes all day, you're the asshole.
Thank you. Yes, he does it mostly by accident, using his X-ray vision and melting everything, and he does step in to make a million pancakes, but sweet Christmas, for a book with Lois's name in the title, she's not coming out on top here. One last story, okay. And it's the cover story, so it best be good. The Witch of Metropolis. Oh boy. So, Lois is told about some witchcraft stuff, and she just laughs off the old superstitions, hilariously before going to a scientist who's working on a youth serum, and she sniffs it, as you would. That night, she turns old, looking like this old, decrepit hag, so naturally she thinks she's a witch now. She goes out and does what she thinks is magic to get some scoops, only at the end to discover that Superman was actually the one doing all these things because he's everybody.
O-A-S-S-H-O-L-E.
I kind of want to give this last story a pass solely because it's her actually learning something, like she shouldn't take shortcuts to get news stories, which is ultimately a very good lesson for journalists. But geez, these stories are not good for the character, which we'll get to, and maybe they actually worked in the 1950s as fun little romps, but come on. Now let's look at what the character's done over 60 years later with Lois Lane number 1. Lois Lane is a crack reporter for the Daily Planet, and this plot actually has her, dun dun dun, being a crack reporter for the Daily Planet on a case to follow the money. But it's not even just that, although it does end with a fantastic scene where she confronts the press secretary at a meeting at the White House. Now, it is hard to make reporting interesting, which is why there's a minor action beat in the middle of this. But Greg Rucka does make it a thrill to watch it unfold, kind of like watching All the President's Men. But we also have Lois dealing with being married to Clark and Superman by, fact Clark is Superman, and how she actually got called a slut for kissing Superman when she's a general celebrity and everyone knows that she's married to Clark Kent. As a story, it's probably something that a lot of people have thought about, but not many really could land right. The ability to showcase the domestic as well as professional life of any character is really hard. The point for story obviously goes to Lois Lane number 1. But what's a comic without art to back it up? The art. This is where I always hate comparing old comics with new ones. The natural mindset is to come down in favor of the modern comic, because typically older comics have a very samey look. And yes, I will be giving the point to Lois Lane in the end of this, but hear me out on why Superman's girlfriend shouldn't be knocked in comparison. Lois Lane is a very dialogue-driven book, and the art, while Mike Perkins does really, really well, generally feels secondary to the story. There's a wondrous scene where Lois comes into a hotel room and without any dialogue strips and gets into the shower with Clark. Except then we do have one quick panel of dialogue. It is a minor thing, and I am really only splitting hairs, but the moment almost gets ruined by literally 6 words. I'm also not a fan of the coloring, but only on certain bits. There is an argument to be made that I read this digitally, so I'm seeing the panels a bit larger than they're probably meant to be. But pulling back, it really doesn't read any better, at least to me. And I know I'm in the minority on this, and I understand if people want to truly defend this. I understand. It's also an issue that comes up when Perkins tries to color brighter. The heavy line work, which I am a huge fan of, looks good when Lois or the Question are in darker areas, like at night or where we can say it plays amazing to add depth to the ending press room scene, but when put into the bare light of day, it's just jarring to me. And it distracts from the emotion of Lois dealing with a relationship with Clark. Granted, it is easy to turn around and then go, well, that's what it's supposed to do, because the whole point of that scene is Lois and Clark's relationship being in the public, having put her in a harsh light. And I could see that from both sides. Superman's girlfriend, however, doesn't have those aspirations. Keeping the comic strip art style that most Golden and early Silver Age comics would have, the colors are bright, the art isn't busy, and very simple line work. However, being so simple, it does mean that it can do more than what a more realistic style can. The first story goes to showcase Superman's powers, which does awkwardly have him drinking a sword. Yes, that picture is up on my Twitter right now, link in the description. The second, while the majority does focus on Lois, the way Superman's X-ray vision works acts as a good reveal for how he screwed over Lois's latest cooking attempt. And of course, the final one really brings this about by shifting the classic look for Lois into an old hag. And the art style does give you clues that Sup is actually using his powers instead of Lois using magic. Not to mention there's a clear distinction between night and day that makes it an easier read overall, despite it being wordy for the sake of wordy. Trust me, if you've ever read any Golden or Silver Age comics, you understand what I mean. As I said at the beginning of this rant, Lois Lane does get the point, but I think that Kurt Schaffenberger deserves a gold star or at least an honorable mentions here. Story and art, however, are only ways to convey who's lead in these stories, so... Characters. Superman's girlfriend loses this one flat out, and I'm not even going to sugarcoat it. The three stories boil down to Lois tries to seduce someone into giving her a scoop by pretending to be another person. Lois pauses her career to try and get Superman to love her through food. And Lois thinks she's a witch and uses what she thinks is magic to be able to get her stories done. Yeah. Now, to be fair, there is a very determined, strong-willed woman hidden under the thick dust of the late 1950s here. I mean, in the first story, she is actively trying to do all she can to get a scoop for his story to better her career. In the second, she is very tenacious, trying again and again despite those food failures. And then there's her being straightforward enough to justify using newfound abilities to again further her career. But it just feels very, very awkward since Superman is a major player in all three stories and generally saves the day. On a personal level, that is. When the only other major character in your story basically does his best to make you look like we in the 21st century think all media portrayals of women in this era is just really hurts. Then we look at Lois Lane in the 21st century and we see how she's become one of the best women in comics. She's still strong-willed and tenacious, unwavering in her resolve, but not so much to be, well, I'm gonna say this out of turn, but modern comics, particularly in the 2010s, have been having a problem writing women, trying to portray them overly strong to the point where they're walled off and basically hard to connect with on a reader level. Not because they need to be vulnerable or fragile or whatever you feel, but because they don't come off as having human emotion. Rucka in this makes Lois amazing because we can actually connect with who she is without her ever feeling like she's an emotional cripple. We can sympathize with her without feeling pity for her. There's actually a specific moment that could have easily come off as heavy-handed in commenting on today's social politics, when Lois snaps at Clark because some guy called Lois a slut, because there's photos of her kissing Superman, and I brought this up earlier. It could have easily turned into a soapbox moment about how men are never labeled negatively, and especially Superman would never be called a bad name for kissing a married woman, though, side note, yeah, he probably would. In fact, there'd probably be tons of media outlets saying it's his fault while defending Lois, especially in 2019 when this comic came out, but that's neither here nor there. But instead of it reading that negatively, while she does snap about it, it comes after we've seen how determined and tenacious Lois is, so it isn't, and God help me, I hate phrasing it this way, a snowflake trying to push back against gender biases. It is a natural moment that reads brilliantly in a market that has a very shaky grounds on trying to play that political line. So again, point to Lois Lane. And yes, that means Lois Lane is most definitely better than the first issue of Superman's Girlfriend, at least in their first issue. But let's not make this a shutout and talk about follow-up and legacy. Follow-up and legacy. Now, I've already brought up that Lois Lane does not have a second issue out, and all of this can come crumbling down if they've decided to go heavy-handed in the following issues. But let's first talk about Superman's Girlfriend. Superman's Girlfriend debuted in 1958, 4 years after Seduction of the Innocent hit the shelves, and we saw a full upheaval of the comics industry due to moral panic. This led to the creation of the Comics Code Authority that same year, and it gutted most any storytelling ability, especially in those early years. The code banned showing any government official, from policemen to judges to politicians, in anything but a positive light, which is actually why there is a pro-law one-page comic in this book. Similarly, you couldn't show any lawmen dying because of criminal activities. Women were not to have any cleavage or low-cut tops, or high skirts. or to be overly suggestive in their mannerisms, posture, literally anything. Seriously, an ace reporter has nothing to do in these books except play to what was selling, which was camp little romances, a la Archie comics. In fact, something I was reading, the only reason that Lois was able to look like an old hag in the last story was because it was a non-horror related change, but rather based on science. You see this kind of thing a lot in comics right after the CCA was founded, and luckily we did see it slowly become less restrictive over the years, which is why in the 134 plus issues of Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane, the evolution was not just of Lois Lane, but of how female characters and comics in general were treated, ramping to probably the most famous or infamous issue, depending, Superman's girlfriend number 106, where Lois goes into a machine to experience being black and we get to discuss racism. And that is where I think Lois Lane number 1 is a perfect continuation from Lois's first full series. It is a perfect example of why Lois Lane needs to exist, not just as Superman's supportive character, but as the woman she is. That being said, does Lois Lane number 1 actually hold up if we look at it from outside of the modern sensibilities brought into it? For the most part, I think yes. A very good comparison to make for the politics presented here would actually be Captain America No More, where Cap gave up his shield because he sided with the American dream and not with the American government. It is a very classic example of a comic writer instilling his own political views into a comic, with it being an indictment against the Reagan administration, while Lois Lane is not exactly hiding its opposition to the Trump administration. Now, I'm not going to be commenting on that particular thing because I'm about the comics here, but the reason that this comic works where, say, Marvel going way too over the top with Nick Spencer's Secret Empire, is that if you take out the modern Trump mindset and put it into a previous administration or its own administration like the one shown in Amazon's Attack, which was based off the Bush administration, I know, it still works. What I mean by that is, hypothetically, you could replace the children being separated from their families and the Russia angle with this with, why is it that your administration says they lost $10 billion in cash when suddenly the bank accounts of these specific political leaders in Iran have gone up coincidentally equaling the money that went missing? The story itself wouldn't really change, although I assume the question would not have let certain other incidents happen if we were talking real-world equivalents. But in short, the lasting power of standing against the White House stays as timeless in this instance, not because it targets the specific leader in charge at the time, but because it uses that specific evil as a building block for the story, and not just as a reason for the story to exist. TLDR, the story is about Lois Lane being the crack reporter she's grown into being, and not just so the punchline can be the watered-down Trump bad man, like many people who have reviewed this comic negatively has said. So, the winner is Lois Lane number 1, and you should honestly buy it and read it for yourself. I've actually got 2 copies, one of the main cover that I've been showing, and the one variant by Jenny Frieson, and I love it. As for Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane, I think that it is best left to be looked at as a whole series rather than just one individual issue, because of the limitations put on the medium at the time. Is it good? No. Is it a perfect example of why a moral panic against comic books based on people who make money off said moral panic is bad? Yes. And with that bombshell, I've never really been good at closing my videos, so that's it. If you agree, disagree, or just want to add your own 2 cents, let me know in the comments below. While you're down there, if you want to suggest an issue for Then and Now, ComicSins, or a reader's history, also let me know. If you liked what you saw, please give us a thumbs up, share us around, and subscribe for more of me overindulging my love of overanalyzing comics. We have a long way to go until we reach that monetization goal of 1,000 subs. We also have a Patreon for people who think that I deserve at least $1 for all the free content I put up. Follow us on Twitter for more quick content or just to flame me because of something I said. But more than anything, I'm AJ the Comic Archivist, and stay golden, Inklings!